My name is Jenny Hurt, as she mentioned. I work for McCarty Family Farms, and I am part of our HR team. I also have Courtney Goodman with me. She is the HR director and the brains of the operation. She makes sure that we stay in legal compliance and do all the things we need to. So she's here for moral support and all the difficult questions that get asked throughout. And I do a lot more with employee relations and interacting and helping on that end, and then supporting everything else she does. So I want to start with telling you a little bit about McCarty Family Farms, just so you have an idea of what we're working with on our end as far as HR management is related. But we did try and keep this very general, so that way it is going to be a broader scope. So a lot of things I talk about in here may not be specific to our company and are probably going to be a more broad perspective that you can utilize and see the bigger picture of it. So McCarty Family Farms is a fourth-generation dairy operation. It's currently owned and operated by 4 brothers, the McCarty brothers, and it has a lot of moving parts right now. So there are 3 dairies in the state of Kansas. There is 1 dairy that is currently transitioning to a heifer raising facility in Nebraska, and then there is a dairy farming partnership in Ohio. I mention that because that all affects HR and different regulations within your company, especially if you're outside and in different states. We also have a milk processing plant in Rexford, and that's important because it falls in a different category than our dairies do. Dairies fall under agriculture, and our plant falls under manufacturing. So once again, we have to treat some things differently based on what they are categorized as, okay? So we have about 225 employees currently. They are spread out at those 5 locations, so that means we have a lot of to and from, and sometimes our structures look very different from what you may encounter in other industries or businesses. You know, a lot of times you have a centralized location, you're working out of that location, and a lot of your employees are there. But in other scenarios, corporate, retail, you may have a centralized HR that then helps work with all of the different places across the United States or even globally. All of that requires additional information. So as we get going here, I'll touch back on some of those things, but the main thing to remember is that it is going to be variable depending on what part of HR you go into and what industry or company you decide to work with. All right, so everything in HR has a little legal consideration, okay? Those legal considerations range everywhere from local laws to state and federal laws, and they don't always match. But the one thing you need to keep in mind is that there is probably something out there that is a guideline, a regulation, or something you need to take into consideration when making decisions for your company. So be sure you're keeping aware of those things, up to date on those things. I'll talk a little bit later about resources that are available to help you do that, and things you can get involved in now to start learning about those different things. A couple of the big ones are labor laws and rights. One of the big ones that's been on topic for a while now is exempt versus non-exempt employees. This deals with compensation, salaried employees, and has a lot of specific indicators in there to decide whether or not you're exempt or non-exempt. As a general rule, salaried employees are going to have certain rules, and they do not necessarily qualify for overtime pay, okay? When there's a lot more that goes into it, though, than just being salaried. They have to make a minimum amount per week, $684. They have to fall into one of 8 categories, job categories. And then within that category, they have to meet the duties test. So then there's specific things within there that actually qualify them for it. So there's a lot of considerations, and as we talk about job descriptions and writing those, you have to take those things into consideration because it needs to align and match up to what your pay is. Employee benefits and compensations, a lot of times those are very broadly grouped together. They play a very important role throughout the entire process of HR, but there are some differentiations between them. And the main thing to know is compensation is direct form of payment for tasks completed by an employee, and they are taxable, fully taxable. The benefits are indirect payments, and they have some variation to them and some different things, and maybe partially taxable. Health and safety is also a consideration. A lot of times people thinking about HR only think about the people side of things. They're there to help people, they're there to work with people, and a lot of that also comes with compliance and then the health and safety within the workplace, okay? There are going to be industry regulations on that. There's also going to be state and local regulations on that. So make sure that's another area you have to keep in mind. Leave entitlements, I think that's a fun phrase, but we don't usually talk about it in that manner. It's vacations, it's PTO, it's sick leave, bereavement, military. Some of these things are protected by regulations and laws. A lot of them have some flexibility and are going to be very dependent on your company policies and standards. And the main thing with that is making sure that it's documented, clearly defined, and fairly distributed to make sure your employees are aware of what those policies are and how your company specifically handles them. And then finally, outside of legalities being in HR, confidentiality. That is a huge, huge part. You are playing a middle role. You are going to have access to a lot of information. You have to manage that information appropriately, and you need to make sure that everybody on each end, managers, your bosses, owners, as well as employees, respect that and understand that there are going to be things that aren't going to go every direction. They're going to stop with you. So just a little bit about HR in general. There's a lot of components to it. That other picture that you saw just a second ago shows some of the different things that are involved in it. But here's some of the basic areas we're going to go over and how some of the things fall into these categories. Oops. So the first one is the big picture. So HR really connects the dots. It's the bridge between your employees and your management, your owners. It has to make sure that we are focusing on the business while still staying within legal realm. You know, not everybody stays up to date on all of those things. So we really have to bridge a lot of gaps within a company. So putting and keeping the pieces together. Some of the key considerations that you need to keep in mind are company growth and progress, external agencies and regulations. So that's where we're talking about state and local law. We're talking about maybe OSHA. Maybe there are regulatory bodies that are concerned with certifications within the workplace and what type of qualifications your employees have. So you have to keep that in mind. Employee needs and expectations. What did you promise them? What did you put out there? What are they expecting for you, and what's within their rights that they know as an employee in general they have rights to? And then obviously confidentiality. How do you make all those pieces work while still protecting confidentiality on all ends of that? So right people, right place, recruiting and retention. This is what most people know HR as. This is the main part of it, okay? But there's a lot of components that go into this, and sometimes we think about different parts of it differently. So the first thing we're going to talk about is job descriptions and specifications. You're out looking for your dream job. You're pulling up Indeed, you're getting information on there, or maybe you still do the classifieds in the newspaper. I don't know, probably not as much. But most of the time you're seeing these job listings online, Facebook postings, digital listings. And you're going to see some variance in them, but most of them follow a general standard, right? You've got a title of what the position is. You've got who the company's for. Sometimes you get a salary range in there. We're going to talk a little bit about that. You have the general overview of the expectations of that position. And usually they're trying to sell you a little bit, right? Great working environment. We'd love to have you join our team. Looking for a highly motivated employee. Really throwing in those buzzwords and fluff words in there. But it gives a kind of broad overview. That's great, and that gives you a starting point. But when you actually go to start hiring your employees, there's a lot of reasons outside of just being transparent that you want to really list out those expectations for your employees. So in some states, Kansas isn't one of them, but you've probably seen if you're into this realm at all, they are starting to pass transparency laws in different states where it is required and mandatory that certain job salaries are posted, and they're not settling for $1 to $1 million. They're wanting it to be what would that range actually look like? And it's required to be posted with it. So that's something that businesses have to keep in mind. It's not up to Indeed to do that for the business. It is the responsibility of the employer to do that. The other side that comes into effect is your descriptions can affect everything from the expectations for your employees as you start to look at performance reviews, as you start to look at, are we doing raises? Are they meeting the expectations of their position? Clear too, you have a workplace injury and now they're requesting light duty or they're wanting some exception made. We have to decide what that looks like. What was their original job requirements? What were they expected to do? So are we altering their position to allow them to come back, or are we providing reasonable accommodations which are required by law? So having those very clearly outlined and in place is going to help your company make the best decisions, as well as protect you should you get into any scenarios that require that. When to use them. So obviously when you're offering a job, you're starting out, you're wanting them to see if it's interested when you're putting out that job description. But then it is also very useful to use at evaluations or performance appraisals. They are useful, again, if you have people filing for workplace injuries and needing to make some assessments that direction. So they really can be utilized throughout the lifetime of an employee, and it's important to be able to revisit those. I put on here broad but detailed. You really don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of things necessarily, because perhaps you don't need to discuss every minute of their day and what they're going to be completing. But you do want them to have a general idea of, are they working with technology? If so, what systems are going to be mandatory? Is there manual labor? Yes, how much are they going to need to be lifting on a regular basis? What does that entail? So you want to keep it broad. You want to include as much of the position as you possibly can. I always love the other duties as assigned added on there. It leaves a little bit open for the employer, but you do want to have some specifics in there. As far as legal considerations, again, you want to look at your state, local, federal laws and what's required for you to post to be transparent. I'm sure you've all heard of equal opportunity employment, right? So there are statements and things like that. You need to follow those guidelines. Those need to be included on any job descriptions and offers and make sure they're in there. And then finally, who should be involved? You're going to have different stakeholders depending on the positions. Does it make sense to have everybody in the company involved every single time? No. Does it make sense that just the person that's in charge of that person should have the key to everything that goes on there? Not necessarily. So you really want to consider who's going to be working with these employees, who are they going to be interacting with on a daily basis, and who are their supervisors? What is that chain of command? And make sure you're getting all of those perspectives so you're not blindsided with anything, and so that also your supervisors and managers know what that role is expected to do. And you don't have a supervisor saying, hey, you know what? I'm going to have them do this today, and that's outside of their scope and outside of what they were hired to do, because that can get touchy and get you into some trouble. So the selection process. The selection process starts obviously with your recruitment and your initial, hey, we're going to start looking for this employee. How are we going to get them to come? So reaching out, getting that target demographic, starting your advertisement. Lots of options for that. I would say digital is definitely the way the world's going these days, but it depends on what your industry is. It depends on what position you're hiring for. If you're hiring for a position that probably is not necessarily highly technologically inclined or utilizing that, an ad on Facebook may not help get to that category. So you've got to look at those things and take considerations. Industry and company standards, that falls in that same line. Look at what other people are doing in that industry. There are realms of the dairy that it makes a lot of sense for us to do Indeed and digital. There's other realms that word of mouth is our number one. So how we treat our employees, what we do for our employees, and how they feel they're appreciated, because they're our number one recruiter. They're out there getting other people to come and be part of our operation. So that changes how you do things. What incentives are we providing to them? What resources are we giving them to reach out? How much do they understand their benefits and what applies to them, so they can tell other people and say, yeah, you want to work here, this is cool. Clear timelines. So when you are hiring and you're in that hiring process, you got to make sure that you're staying consistent and that you are treating all applicants fairly and you're respecting their time, because it doesn't set a very good tone when you offer them an interview, you interview them, and I don't know, maybe in a month we'll let you know. Most people looking for a job are looking for a job, right? They're not interested in waiting for the, oh, okay, I'll just sit around until you call me. That's fine, no concern. So keep that consistent and don't allow that to happen. You want to have a time frame and know that you're ready to hire and what that looks like, and make sure all your stakeholders are on board with that. And what I mean by stakeholders are, who are your decision makers? Is the manager playing a role? Don't interview and then go on vacation for 2 weeks. That's probably not a good time to hold an interview, if they're not going to be there and ready to discuss that applicant. Consistent and transparent process, again, along the same lines, you have to treat applicants equitably, okay? So you need to make sure that when you're hiring for a role, every time you hire for that role, you're holding the same standard. So if you're interviewing applicant 1 and there's 3 people involved and they were required to submit a resume and supporting documents, and then we're going to move on to a round 2 interview, you need to treat applicant 2 the same way. If you know applicant 2 and they pop up and like, we know what they do, we don't need their resume, that's not being equitable, okay? It's important that you keep those processes standard, transparent, and fair across the board. Reason being is there are situations where people file for discrimination because they felt they were treated unfairly or not considered fairly. So have your ducks in a row. That may not have been the case at all. You may not have been doing anything preferential, but you need to have supporting documents for that. Which leads into the legal considerations. Obviously, make sure you're following all those guidelines. There are different expectations state to state on what you need to do and what paperwork is going to be required should you encounter a lawsuit or a case like that, which that stuff filters through HR, so you'll get to deal with that as well. And again, who should be involved. So just take into consideration who they're going to be working with, and make sure that they're, the key stakeholders are playing a role. All right, so compensation and benefits and training. This is the sticker, right? This is what attracts your employees, compensation and benefits. That's the first thing I'm looking at when I look at a job usually, right? Like, here's what I kind of want to do. How much does it pay, right? So we want to make sure that that makes sense. You want to make sure it's in line with industry standards, and that includes everything. Compensation, also your benefits. And what falls into benefits? Flexible work schedules, remote working. You can't be a data analyst company that is going to require your employees to be in office 10 hours a day and expect to get all the applicants, because most data analyst jobs are able to have a flexible schedule and work remotely. So you're going to put yourself out of that race, and they're going to be looking for those other opportunities. So make sure you're taking those things into consideration and looking at the industry. Progression and succession plans on training are also extremely important. Sometimes we only think about what is required within a company. So we have OSHA regulation. We're going to do safety training. Yeah, of course. You're a new hire. We need to make sure you know how to do every part of your job. Okay, we're going to do new hire. Well, this is a brand new system. We're going to train everybody on that. That's all great, and you want to incorporate all those things, and you need to. But there's another side of it too. It doesn't have to be formal training always. Sometimes it is a progression plan. So how are you making sure that the right connections are being made, that you want to be able to move someone into another position? If they just do their position all day long and never get any overlap into that realm, it's very hard to make an easy transition with that. So as HR, as you're strategizing, you have to figure out what that looks like, see what those natural progressions are, and figure out how you're going to overlap those people. Considering your target employee. Again, this comes down to position, comes down to industry, and comes down to how you're looking for them. But your benefits need to align with that as well, like we talked about a little bit. Your compensation needs to align with that. It may look very different across the board. It's hard to go from, here's what I did, and here were the benefits I got in this job, and now I'm switching industries. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to work that way. And legal, again, there's rules and regs to everything, so just make sure you're staying up on your state laws. Oops. Retention. So everything that we just talked about plays a role in retention as well. Job descriptions set the expectations for your employees. It's no fun to get into a job, know what you signed up to do, and then get told, I'm adding 15 things to your role, and that employee's going, I'm not getting paid for this. That's not what I was hired to do. So you start off on a bad foot right there. So make sure they're up to date. They do include everything that's going to be expected, and that compensation is adequate for what they're doing. Selection process, equity and consistency. Again, this is the perception of that employee to what they see of the company, all right? So you want to make sure that it is fair and consistent. They need to see, once they're on the other side, you've hired them, they're working for you, they need to see that you're being equitable with your new hires, you know? That just sets that perception. Compensation, this goes to show your investment in that employee, as well as insight into what they're doing, what their day-to-day job responsibilities are. Do you really understand what you're asking them to do? Training, again, you're investing in that employee and you're helping them progress. I know that when we're interviewing, lots of times we have employees ask, or potential employees, where can I go from here? What are my options for growth? Do I have the potential to move into another position? You know, there's that natural desire to progress, to move on, to make more money. So you have to take those things into consideration and make sure that employees are able to see that. And then what else is needed? Well, obviously the work environment makes a huge difference on whether an employee enjoys where they work. There are a lot of legal regulations put into place to help employers. I think that anybody in HR, their natural desire is to help employees and help people and make them comfortable, and it's what you want to do. But there's also legal regulations that help with that. The American Disabilities Act. There is, I'm going to butcher all of these, but obviously equal opportunity. There is also the Equal Pay Act, Pregnancy Discrimination Act, lots of different things that are set in place to make sure that you are protecting these employees. And it's also protecting you as an employer. So understanding those regulations, creating that environment. Most of us probably don't need a regulation to know what we need to do to treat people fairly, but there's lots of resources within there that can help you adjust your workplace if it's needed. Also, accountability. Now, sometimes I feel like accountability and performance evaluations get a bad rap because they're seen as possibly negative or a hassle. I know that yearly evaluations are not standard anymore. People are really getting away from that. And I think that that's one of the biggest things in HR that we can do is promote these types of things in a positive manner. To do that, you have to implement them effectively and make sure they're attached to a benefit or to progression. So, you know, if you're just doing a review and it counts for nothing and it's literally we're checking some boxes and that's done for the year, it doesn't really have any purpose. Employees are like, why do we do this? This is a pain. What's going on? If they know that it's directly related to them being able to get a promotion in the future, if it's directly related to what does the pay scale look going forward, those things make a difference. And it doesn't have to be necessarily promotions and pay. It can be other things, but connect those dots for them. Help them understand that. You are trying to add value to their day-to-day, to their resume, things that they can continue to build upon and improve personally, because knowledge within self is something that no one else can take away from you, right? That is something you get to take, whether you have this job, a different job, you go do something totally different, that all goes with you. So giving employees that opportunity is huge. You know, with the performance appraisals, it's not that they're required, there's not a regulation on them, but they can help you if you get into certain situations. So if you need to terminate an employee for performance, okay, these things happen, but you haven't done a single review with them, you have no documentation of poor performance previously, you don't have anything to support what you're saying. Now you have an employee that got fired and is applying for unemployment, and you have no documentation to support it, even though they were not a good fit in your company or they went against company policy or didn't meet the standards. So you have to make sure those documentations are important. They protect the employee, they protect you, and they help you with those future things. So making sure that you have those documentation and helping your managers have documentation when there are situations can help going forward as well. All right, supporting balance. Work, life, and policy. So HR has a very hard role. We live in black and white because there's so many regulations that need to be taken into consideration, but none of us in this room, including Courtney and I, live our lives in black and white 24/7. We're usually in the gray, right? Life happens, okay, but this scenario kind of calls for this. Well, but I'm kind of thinking this makes more sense this time. That becomes hard to do because you have to balance those and to mitigate risk to the company as well. So, got a pretty picture of a Jenga up here because all of these pieces keep piling on top of each other, and it completely matters what order they're in as to whether everything's standing or everything's crumbling to the ground. But you have to be able to move pieces to play the game, right? You have to be able to move things around, change where it's at, look at things differently, have a different perspective of it. And you have to take, how many people, surely everybody's played Jenga, right? Sitting there, tapping on one, is there enough gap there? What are the supporting? And when you're making decisions in HR, you have to think like that. Some of the things to consider are, obviously, life happens, right? If your company has a strict policy for if you're late, you're riding up, no excuses, but then someone gets in an accident on the way to work, how are you handling that now, right? Are you gonna write them up because they got in an accident? So make sure your policies are aligning and leaving some flexibility, right? Set a precedent, now what? So what I mean by that is you have a situation at work where a salaried employee has used all of their PTO time. They now need some more days. It doesn't qualify for FMLA, which is family medical leave. It's kind of a personal thing, but you're not finding where they qualify for anything else, and they want to ask you, but they really can't afford to not get their salary that week. They need to not take any unpaid days, and they're asking you for an exception. Can I have additional days? You have to really think. Now, you may be going, oh my gosh, this makes perfect sense. I need to do this for that employee. But you know what that does? It sets a precedent. And now anybody else in the company says, well, but you did it for her. Why is that more important than what I'm telling you right now? And you get yourself in a sticky situation because you can't fall back on policy and say, our policy book clearly states you only get this many days and you don't have that option. But if you did it once, you're putting yourself in a situation. So it's not that it's not okay to make exceptions. You're going to do that sometimes. It's going to be necessary. But it's important for you to think about everything that goes along with that and make sure that any stakeholders, supervisors, managers, anybody pushing for that exception to be made is also aware of the precedent that sets. Company growth versus risk management. This gets sticky. So as an HR representative, you are there to make sure that your company follows compliance standards, state, federal law. Sometimes those things don't line up, which we'll talk about. Sometimes the company view doesn't line up with what the regulations are. Sometimes for the company, it makes more sense to take a slap on the hand and a fine than to fully commit to a regulation. These things happen, okay? It's part of the business world. Your job is to mitigate that risk and make sure everybody's fully aware of what's going on. You are probably not the final decision maker, and that's a hard place to be in. You may know 100% within you what's right and what the law says, and there might be some flex room or pressure from your supervisors to do something a little different. It's a hard place because you're going to disagree with your bosses, which is not where a lot of people want to be. They don't want to be on the opposing end of a view, especially with who's writing their checks for them. But it's going to be required of you sometime. And any company is going to understand that that is your role, and it's important that you stay true to that. So make sure you're understanding, make sure you're presenting all sides of it, make sure that everyone's fully aware, and then move on from there with the decision. So again, local, state, federal laws, you're going to see variation in these. There's federal federal minimum wage, which is set at $7.25 down there. And then there's different states that have it at 15. So what are you going to follow? Well, you're going to follow your state in that scenario, you know. Marijuana is illegal, right? Federal says marijuana is illegal. You can't sell it. You can't do things with it like that. But there's states that have legalized it, okay? And what does that affect you as an employer and HR an employer? You have drug tests, right? You might be doing pre-employment drug tests. You might be doing randoms. You know, how do you make all of that work? If you have DOT employees, you're following it to the book. You don't have a choice on that. If you have other employees and you're in a state that allows recreational marijuana use, you might have to rewrite your plans for that, and you have to take those things into consideration. You know, reach out to other people in your industry and figure out what they're doing. And some of it, you know, it's very new to a lot of people with that, and there probably isn't the perfect plan yet. And so it's always going to be a work in progress and reevaluating what you're doing. So resources and opportunities. Here in Kansas, the Kansas Department of Labor does an amazing job of putting out resources. So everything I was talking about with exempt and non-exempt employees, they've got worksheets, they've got all the categories, they'll help you figure out the duties test to where you can go through that. If you're dealing with whether an employee qualifies for FMLA, they have fact sheets for that. So, you know, if you're wanting to learn and see what all encompasses that, take a chance to go out to the website. They've got all kinds of stuff there, fact sheets, information that really will go through in much more detail to the legalities of a lot of that. SHRM is a Society for Human Resource Management. Kansas has a chapter of it. You can go out to their website as well. They actually offer some really cool discounts for students that are interested to go to conferences that are local. There is a Colby outreach chapter for the Western Kansas chapter, so you're welcome to get involved in that as well. And just start to see and learn about different things and meet with other people that are in that field already. And then shadowing and internships. This gets hard because I can tell you firsthand as HR, where do we need help? Paperwork. That's what we want somebody to come in and help us with, is paperwork. That's not the glamorous, fun side. That's not the interacting with employees, but it's a very necessary side. So don't be surprised if you're starting to look that direction that you get to do paperwork. That's okay. That's not everything that's in the job, but it's a foundation. It's an understanding. It's where you get to see, because there's regulation on how you store files for employees. You can't have an employee's medical file next to their employment file. They need to be separated. I mean, there's lots of things there that you need to understand. Start from the beginning, okay? Look for those opportunities. I can tell you that there are plenty of HR departments that would love to have someone come assist with that. And then finding the area that fits best. HR looks different at any company you go to. There is not a cookie cutter shape of what an HR department looks like. We're a team of two. She was a team of one. She built HR at McCarty Family Farms from the ground up and has made it what it is today. And those things transition and change. There's a lot of things that have to happen in HR, and a company may separate those things out. Maybe they're hiring a recruitment person. Maybe they're hiring talent management. Maybe they're hiring employee benefits coordinator. There's going to be a lot of realm to that, okay? Like I said, Courtney's the brains of the operation. She makes sure what we do stays in compliance. I enjoy and like to be out and work with employees, but then I always go, can we do this? Is this okay? Where does this fall on things? And it's good. We need both of those roles. There has to be a balance. But make sure when you're looking for HR jobs, you're not just clicking on anything that says HR position, because you have to make sure that you align with the culture of that company, what they're focusing on, what they want to do with their employees, and that the job makes sense for you. Because if paperwork truly isn't your thing, don't apply for a job that is literally all you're going to do. You're not doing the employee interaction side. Make sure you're taking those things into consideration and that you're looking for that. And then certifications. So Courtney is a PHR, so she holds certification in that. There are a realm of different certifications out there, all for varying things. Hers covers international HR, global HR, unions, a very wide scope of everything. There's other certifications that can be much more specific and tailored to maybe your role in HR. SHRM offers a couple of HR certifications. Most of them require 3 to 5 years of experience to apply and get started with them. But they are maybe on different levels. You're dealing with actual day-to-day, or, you know, I'm high level, we're implementing policies, programs, those types of things. So don't just go out and get the first certificate that you see for HR. Make sure it makes sense for what your long-term goals are, and make sure you know where you're going to fall in HR long-term as well to just have the most benefit from it. Okay, well, that's everything I have. We'll open up for questions. Like I said, Courtney will be more than happy. The big group speaking's not her favorite thing in the world, but she would be more than happy to answer questions or meet with anybody one-on-one if you do have specifics, because she knows a lot more about the very specific legal end of things than I do. But we'll open up for any questions if anybody has any.
What's the most common thing that you guys deal with in that area of industry and the HR department? What's the most common issue?
I would say, and Courtney can jump in on this, I would say we probably have a top 5 list that we deal with on a regular basis. The first thing that tends to create a lot of it is just language barriers. And while that's not necessarily a write-up or a concern, it changes how we interact with our employees. And so we have to approach things very differently, knowing where our employees come from, their background. You know, most of you would go to a job and expect insurance to be part of it. You'd have a general understanding. You've used insurance before. We have quite a few employees that have never had insurance. They aren't sure how to utilize it. So our conversation about that and how we present it to our employees has to look very different. So that's a consideration that a lot of places maybe don't have to take into consideration. You know, we're not just saying, hey, here's everything your insurance has to offer. We're also saying, here's the local doctors you can use. Here's how you'll use your insurance. Here's what to expect with that, and doing a bigger picture. Past that, we have a lot of safety compliance that we have to align with. Different partners. We are unique in that we are non-GMO, we are B Corp certified, we are Validus certified, we have BQA, we have a lot of third-party bodies that have requirements on us and how we treat our employees, our animals, our benefits. And so we have to take all of those into consideration. So safety, compliance, making sure we have everything in place that supports that, because it's not enough to say, it's 100 days since our last accident. It has to be, what are you doing weekly? What are you doing monthly? What is in place resources-wise to make that happen? And then obviously, it's a hazardous work environment. There is potential for injury. We do deal with work comp on a regular basis, and making sure that that's being handled appropriately. We're taking care of our employees, and we're preventing that from happening as much as possible. But it is a part of it, and it's something that, depending on what industry you work on, you may never experience that ever, you know, in certain industries. But it's very likely if you get into our industry. Yeah, good question. What else? Anything else? Yes, sorry.
That you were losing money in your business, what would you, like, let's say you had to lay off some people, would you be able to do that because you're losing money, or would you have to do something else to get more money? Because you can't just fire somebody because you need more money and you can't pay them anymore.
Yeah, there would be a lot of considerations that would have to go into that. I don't know if you have a general way that you would approach that, but you know, that's going to have a lot of different input in there. Layoffs are obviously an option. It's definitely not what a company wants to do. Not something.
Sometimes you'll offer a severance package or give them other options of different places they can go, partnering with people when it comes to that as well.
Yeah, supporting them. I see what you're saying, because it's, you know, you're firing, but laying off also comes with a different concept, which allows for some different protections, rights, and benefits to the employee that's being laid off. And it qualifies them for other things outside of the company realm. So within state and federal services as well, it qualifies them. So it's important, the terminology is really important on that. Anything else?
Is McCarty Farms unionized?
No.
As you mentioned, unions are.
Yep. Nope, we are not. We are appreciative of that. That comes with a whole nother realm of thing, and that definitely is something that you want to take into consideration when you're applying for jobs, because it comes with a whole different gambit of responsibilities, regulations, how you can interact with employees. Unions have a lot of control over things like that. So could definitely change the landscape for sure. Anything else? Okay. Well, thank you guys very much. I'm glad I got to come present. I don't know if you guys know, I used to work here in the college. Spent about 5 years here and really enjoyed it. So I was very excited to get to come back and present to students and spend some time. So thank you for that. If you do have questions, need anything one-on-one, we've also got some business cards if you want to touch base with us or just have that contact information, you're welcome to it. And yeah, thank you guys.